So, yeah, and I was thinking a little bit about that work, and I'm going to try to weave some of that into the things I'm talking about here. But I've also been thinking about Matt's earlier comments about the traditional randomized controlled trials that have been so important to us. And I'm saying, that's wonderful. They're now considered traditional. I remember a long time ago, talking with David Olds about actually doing a randomized trial. That was possible. And also, following people up that long, that's possible. And actually, do we really believe that we can prevent anything? That was the zeitgeist of 25, 30 years ago. So we've come a long way, but we're moving actually, I think, further in this thinking about precision. So what I wanted to do was to frame this, first of all, sort of in the area I know. By the way, I am not a home visitation researcher, okay? I've been working in the area of prevention science, though, for a long time, and I think another thing that that Matt had said was that there are things to be learned from a number of different disciplines because we're all facing a lot of the same issues. So in prevention science, this actually comes from the 90s, this idea that we start out with epidemiology to figure out what some of the problems are, and then we jump quickly to etiology to try to understand the risk mechanisms and protective mechanisms that lead people down good pathways or bad pathways, particularly the malleable ones. We design efficacy trials based on that. Then we move, if we're getting some effects, to look at effectiveness in the real world, and then on to dissemination and implementation. Now, I'm going to focus primarily here on the the connection of etiology and efficacy, but also the other thing that Mary has pointed out is that we don't just think about what we want to move around, we need to think about how we do it. And this is a term Dave McKinnon has used. Dave, I don't think Dave's here today, but Dave will be talking about mediators tomorrow. He is Mr. Mediation. Action theory really involves those kinds of ways of thinking about how we change things, how we move them. And I remember David used to talk about this issue of people take my program and try to apply the principles, but they ignore the practices. And what Mary is focusing on is a set of theories of action of how you actually move things here, how you work with that transaction between your intervener and your family, which is so important. So in fact, we can think about action theory having to do with those kinds of issues, influencing, hopefully, targets, our etiology, things that we can change so that bad things don't happen in the future and good things do. Action theory should drive our components, how we put together an intervention. We haven't always been as thoughtful about that in prevention science, perhaps, as we should be, and I think Mary's example is a great one. Etiology has to do with the targets. I talk about RPM targets, risk mechanisms, and those things that protect us in the face of risk. And I say mechanism, I'm not just talking factor, I'm talking about dynamic things that might change, such as how a parent dynamically shifts in their interaction with their child in the moment. And of course, if we change those, we hope that we will have an effect on future health outcomes. So we have targets here. Those targets, risk and protective mechanisms. And as Matt pointed out, of course, it's always fun when someone steals your slide or actually has a slide like yours, that one of the questions we have is, do our program components operate in the same way in changing those targets for everybody? Okay, so that's the moderator question. Now there's another question here, which we probably won't spend as much time on, which is, are there differences in people and contexts, by the way? We talk about moderators as people, but we got to think about moderators as context as well, in terms of how changes in those targets may end up leading to outcomes. We'll focus here primarily on this piece. And of course, we have to ask which moderators. Now, when you look in the field, people are beginning to move more towards looking at moderation, that question of what works for whom. And of course, where do we go? Well, we go to the usual suspects, to begin with. Well, we look at age, gender, SES, race, ethnicity, genes, urban and rural differences, perhaps, southern versus northern, okay? And those usual suspects are important. I think we need to keep those in mind, but I'm going to actually suggest a slightly different direction here. I'm going to suggest what I'll actually call something it's been sitting right in front of us as researchers for a long time. And by the way, I put myself in this camp of not having attended to this as much as perhaps I should, but which I think is a low-hanging fruit, which is what we've called baseline targets, okay? A baseline target is really just the level of that target risk mechanism or protective mechanism measured at baseline prior to intervention. Basically, these families come into Mary's study, and some of those parents are going to be pretty lousy at being sensitive to an infant or a child. Some of them are going to be better. There's going to be variation in that target at baseline. As Mary pointed out, intuitively you say, okay, if they're doing really well, why work on that? Is it the people that we need to work on that have baseline targets where they're not doing so well in terms of our theory? So the baseline target moderation hypothesis in its first form, and I want to say more about this because this is sort of a duh, but there's more to it, I think. Those who show elevations on a specific mechanism, risk mechanism, or low levels of a specific protective mechanism at baseline stand to benefit more from the intervention. It makes sense, right? If you don't have that skill, capacity, a way of dealing with the world, then you may be the one who needs more of it. So let me give you an example of actually looking at this. And by the way, I'll say one of the things I will point out is that we haven't been doing this a lot, even though I think it's sitting right in front of us in many, many of our studies. I think we already have a lot of the data to look at this, although it's not a bad idea to plan ahead. So this is from something I'm a bit more familiar with. This is the Familias Unidas intervention. This is not for infancy. This is focusing on adolescence. It's work that Willie Prado, Hilda Pantin, Tatiano Perino have been working on for a number of years at the University of Miami. And this is a program for Latino or Latina families to prevent adolescent substance use. A lot of this has been NIDA funded. And also more recently looking more broadly into other kinds of outcomes such as internalizing of depression and anxiety, which I've worked on with this. One of their primary targets here is family communication. Based on an action theory that comes out of early work in family systems theory, Jose Sapochnik doing work to translate this into interventions with Latina families, a focus on how parents and adolescents communicate, how they can do this in a better way, how they can do it in a worse way, and how you can sort of help them not go down the bad path of bad communication. Okay? And it turns out that that's a primary target for their intervention. Now, one of the things that is a little tricky with looking at moderators is numbers. And so sometimes it's kind of hard to test moderation if you don't have large samples. We worked with Willie and Hilda and Tatiano to put together three of their data sets from 3 trials of the Familias Unidas intervention. These are 3 randomized field trials, and they are, one of them is a universal trial in that it just took kids from a high school, okay, so it wasn't a specific targeted higher risk group. 2 of these would be considered indicated prevention. That is, they are targeting families where the adolescents are already showing some problems, particularly in one case, primarily problem behaviors, and another one, actual delinquency. Although again, they were not all the way into major substance abuse. Putting these together, we had 723 adolescents and their families. We used what are called integrated data analysis techniques, which I won't talk about here, to actually combine these data. But what it allowed us to do was to look at this question of, is it the case that baseline parent-adolescent communication might be important for understanding who's going to benefit and who doesn't? So, simple thing, most people are doing this now. When you have a target, you tested it pre-test. So they actually measured this at pre-test before assigning people to these various interventions and control groups randomly. Then they assessed a number of things over time, 2 to 4 times over 12 to 36 month follow-ups to look at some of the longer term outcomes. So, first of all, interesting question. Is there really variation in baseline communication? And the answer is yes. Okay, the blue curve here reflects the variation in communication in the universal group. So this actually goes from poor communication to better communication, all right? Now the red line, which is not as easy to see, actually reflects the levels of baseline communication in the selected groups. Notice those selected groups were higher risk. So we would say, oh, they have worse family communication. Well, yes, on average, you can see the averages moved over, but look at the variability. There are a substantial minority of people who do this pretty well. And there are another group of them who don't do it so well, and you can see they even go a little further down the line in terms of being perhaps more at risk because of this factor. Okay, so we then said, let's look at intervention status. Look at, in this case, our distal outcomes. The distal outcome here, change in distal outcome being change in internalizing, and see if the levels of that baseline target actually do moderate the impact. And the answer is, yes, they did. This side of this slide shows the families that were showing weaker levels of, great, thank you, of communication at baseline. And you will notice, by the way, this is a slope in internalizing, so better is lower, go down more, all right? And we see that those in the intervention group went down a lot faster in internalizing than those in the control group. Notice this is the outcome if they started with weaker communication. But if they started with strong communication, there really aren't any differences, okay? So we're not showing, notice there is less improvement. Realize this is going down. This isn't necessarily where they started on internalizing. So there's less improvement there, which would make sense. If, why would these people improve if you're targeting communication? And at least in this particular study, they're already at the top. Their kids aren't showing improvement. Now there's another interesting question here, and it is, so that's a baseline target moderation. That's what I call it, the BTM model, all right? But there's another interesting question, and is it the case that the intervention had an impact on communication afterwards? So that has to do with the question of change in our target from our intervention. Does that vary according to that baseline? And the answer is yes. Those who had weaker communication to begin with in the intervention group show improvement in communication compared to controls. Those who had stronger communication don't. Okay, makes sense. And of course, there's the final question. Is it the case that this mediates the impact on outcome? Because remember, we found that differential effect here, we found that differential effect here, but we do kind of need to check to see if this is actually carrying the impact. And so that's a little more complicated if we look at intervention condition influencing communication, communication influencing internalizing, that's a mediated pathway. Is that pathway, at least in this part, different for those two groups? Now this is a more complex slide in that what's on the left here is the mediated effect. It's the indirect part of the impact. And what we have here is parent-adolescent communication. And what we do find is that, in fact, on this part of the parent-adolescent communication, where things are worse, you get mediation. Here, you don't, which makes sense. Again, this is all by way of saying that that target seems to be really important, and also knowing something about the level of where people come in with that target is important. Now, more recently, this group actually participated with another batch of prevention scientists in looking at the evidence they had on suicidality. And in terms of suicidal behavior, they get exactly the same finding. This is just in one study, and this is a universal trial, showing that, again, suicidality in these adolescents is influenced by parent-adolescent communication, and changes in that reduce risk for suicidal behavior in these kids up to 2 years later for those who had poor communication, but not for those families who didn't. Okay, so what's the relevance of this for precision programming? A couple of things. One, this is sort of here now. This is a little different. This is just from baseline to post-test. And this is saying that this kind of model, this kind of thinking can provide nuanced information for more precise targeting. This is the idea that for a protective target, the intervention has an impact on people compared to control if they are on the weaker end, but if they already have that protective target, there's not going to be a difference. Okay? Okay, in some ways, yeah, this is a little bit of a duh. Although it's interesting, we haven't been looking at this as much. But that's not the only possibility. This is another possibility. And in fact, particularly in education, a number of prevention programs have found this kind of pattern, which is rich get richer. It is the idea that the people who start out with higher levels of protective target actually are those who benefit more than those who don't have it. So that's, we would actually say, well, that's probably good that we're having an impact, but we got to keep that in mind because that's another possible effect here, and it may not exactly be the one we want, okay? Now, another possibility is that it doesn't make a difference, that everyone benefits, and that, in fact, there's room for growth in both groups. So testing this becomes important to know which of these models might be there. Now, we can also extend this, particularly if we're interested in having multiple targets, which we always do. I mean, Mary was talking about 3 parenting targets, but yet there are 3 separate targets of types of parenting behavior, or parent-child interaction, we might say. Okay? And we can look at those in a single study. And here's an example. This is Nancy Gonzalez at Arizona State, has been doing a lot of work on the Bridges Puentes program. This is a program for Mexican-American families. Again, this is focusing on adolescents and focusing here now on not just on parenting, but on kids' coping skills. So it has a whole parenting frame, but it also has a piece of intervention that works with the adolescents about how you cope with your daily life, how you deal with the stressors, how you deal with the challenges involved. Those were targets of intervention, including parenting, a sense of coping efficacy, school engagement in the kids, and they did, again, long-term follow-ups. Now, in this case, a broader set of follow-ups, internalizing, externalizing, and substance use. Randomized field trial that Nancy and her group have been working on for a while. This is 516 families, so it's a fairly large sample. And again, measuring these things at baseline, at targets, and then at follow-ups, both the targets and the outcomes. Here are the results, and this is complicated, but the take-home message here are 2 or 3. Most of the targets at the top are parenting, very specific aspects of parenting, supportive parenting, positive reinforcement, harsh parenting, monitoring in both moms and dads, as well as youth coping efficacy and school engagement. A couple of things to note here. Yes, they get baseline target moderated mediation for several of these, but not for all of them. So, and they really walk the walk here. They beforehand said, these are the things we're targeting. We hypothesized, and then they said, we will test every single one to see if we get it or not. And they got some, but not all. So, for example, mother's positive reinforcement, those moms who were poor on positive reinforcement, when they came in, actually showed improvements, and their kids did better on substance use and internalizing. This is our predicted BTMM pattern. Similarly, for harsh parenting for moms. Interestingly, not so much for dad on those, although for dad what was interesting was monitoring. Notice the thing about monitoring. That is, do dads attend to and know about what's going on with their adolescents? And the answer was, yes, that was important for those dads that didn't monitor as much. Notice that the outcomes are different. Those are on externalizing and also their GPA. But this is a rich get richer effect. So that's saying that those, even though some dads came in with pretty good monitoring, getting better made a difference. So the kinds of outcomes here can actually be somewhat different. The kinds of effects can be different not only for the mediator, for the target you have, and for the outcome. And one of the big findings in prevention science, I think over the past couple of decades, the Institute of Medicine report a couple of years ago pointed this out, is that prevention programs have broad impact across a range of areas of functioning, which of course should be, most of you would say, well, duh. A good part of the rest of the scientific community would say, oh, really? But, these interventions, particularly family-based interventions, do have spreading and radiating effects. Okay, so a couple of points on this. First of all, this approach can be applied to a range of intervention design. So you're going to be hearing a bunch of things today. We talked about the classic prevention trials, and that's what I've been describing. But also the adaptive intervention designs you see today are quite easy to add in pre-test as a potential moderator of the adaptive effects. I don't know if we're doing micro-randomized trials. Some of them, I don't think so here. So that's another area. And micro trials, which I want to talk a bit about because I think I'm probably the only one who pushes on this. The idea behind a micro trial, and I really got into this after saying, you know, a full-scale trial takes a lot of time and energy and money, and you all know how, those of you who've done this know, you have the scars to show for it. One of the things that we started focusing on is this idea that perhaps it's not a bad idea to try to see if we can move a target with our action models before we put it into a full-scale intervention. So a micro trial, this is something that, it's just a term that Steve Beach and Gene Brody and I came up with a few years ago, but it defines a type of study, which is a randomized experiment to test the effects of a relatively brief and focused environmental manipulation, which is hypothesized to change a target, okay? Target and change specific mechanisms, but it's not predicted to actually bring about that full treatment or prevention effect. So it's saying, okay, I have a specific target, let's see, can we make a change in it and see if it works? Here's a good example of that. It's work that Denny Fishbein did a number of years ago, and Denny was interested in ninth graders. She had a group, half were high risk with a history of conduct disorder and half not. Targeting here, the mechanism, the very specific mechanism, is just the ability to negotiate conflict without escalating into aggression. Now that turns out to be a part of that's a target of an intervention called PACT, Positive Adolescent Choice Training. And there is a single module in that multi-module intervention, multi-week intervention, which focuses on this. So what Denny said was, well, let's see if that module by itself can have an impact. Now another thing she did, which I think was, and by the way, this is not a baseline target. Here she's focusing on one of the, maybe I'll call them a sort of a partial usual suspect, but she looked at levels of impulsivity and also history of conduct disorder in these kids. And the other thing she did was this really high quality assessment of kids' ability to do this using a virtual reality-based vignettes of peer interaction. And so she could look not only at whether this randomized experiment, just the kids were only in this module for an hour or so, look to see if it had an impact on how they approached these peer situations in a virtual reality task. And then she looked at whether that differed according to whether they were high in impulsivity or conduct disorder or not. Okay, and what she found was that the PACT effects were attenuated for those high in impulsivity. So if you think about it, if you think those high in impulsivity are those who may not be doing as well with this, then this is actually suggesting a rich get richer effect. That the kids who are low on impulsivity gained, but those aren't necessarily the ones who we would want to gain. More to the point, and this was really sobering, the effects were actually reversed for the conduct disorder group. The PACT module made them worse. Those kids who went through the PACT module who were high conduct disorder, when they went into that virtual reality task, got more aggressive. So this, although I didn't have a slide for it, suggests that baseline targets might actually show iatrogenic effects. That is, now this isn't a baseline target, but it's possible that we think those people who are not doing so well will do better in our intervention. Occasionally we may have to worry that they do worse depending on how we treat them. So it's something we have to consider. Okay, so the possible implication of this for precision programming, one, when we have these kinds of effects, we can think about selecting intervention components based on baseline target assessment. Now this actually, I would suggest, is sort of has been done in a somewhat different way in the family checkup model that people are using, where you do an initial assessment for needs and then you focus your components on those needs. Now that assumes that separate components are there for different targets. And that's testable using those microtrial designs. In fact, if we add in baseline target moderation in a microtrial design, we can see if in fact that makes a difference. Secondly, and something I haven't seen done, is this question about whether those targets cluster, because that's an issue we face. Is it the case that those parenting behaviors influence one another, that they are constrained, for example, by relationships within a couple, things like that? Okay. So summarizing the case for this, it's consistent with, this is using moderators that are consistent with theory. They're already integrated into our action theories. So these are moderators that we already are thinking about. It can be applied to a range of trial designs. The measure of targets is becoming more common practice, so often the costs are minimal. We're already collecting the data, although it does make sense to do high quality measurement. And we can identify subgroups for whom targets may be particularly relevant or irrelevant. Okay? And guiding perhaps microtrial tests of this before we move to full trials. So thanks to all of the people who have helped me think about this and do work on this over the years. Thanks to the funders, here are a few references. And of course, this is one of my favorite quotes for obvious reasons. Thank you for your attention.